Okay. Hello, Epidemics. Only one person has made a guess about how many kids are in that family. Anybody? Oh, and that one person has got it. Anybody want to explain their answer? Or anybody who's
So I think the wording was tricky, unless it was Jerry whose answer was correct, because he just commented too, so I don't want to.
it's you, Nate.
Okay. So I thought it was 14 at first, because if you look, your parents have 6 sons, including you. Each son has 1 sister. So you're like, okay, 6 plus 6 for each sister. Like 6, that was my initial train of thought. And then I'm like, nope. So each son has 1 sister. So it's just 1 sister, 6 sons, including you and mom and dad. So the answer is 9.
Yeah. That's
Well, I was right too. I wasn't concluding the mom and dad. Who said the dad was even around? I thought we were talking about the children. So 7 children. So I'm right. Cheers.
either way works. But yes, the sister is the same sister for all of the sons. Okay. So
When is spring break? Are we creeping up on that?
it's coming up in March.
Okay.
Spring break is March 15th and 17th.
Oh wow, we got a month. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. And I screwed up here. I am so used to just copying the assignments over and over. But what we actually have this week is we have essay 1. Yeah, Nate, go ahead.
So no journal or quiz.
No journal, no quiz, just an essay this week.
Okay, because I saw the essay. I just spent like 3 hours doing some research. I would have been bummed out if it wasn't due at all. So thanks.
Nope, that's the only thing we have this week. So yeah, I've given you some information, some instructions on the essay, and I've given you your suggested topics. So what you do is you pick one topic and you write a short essay on it. These are graded a little harder than your journal prompts. So make sure you get some science in there. This is technically a science class. I've really been enjoying reading a lot of the journal entries. You guys have been doing a pretty good job there. I've really enjoyed those. So I'm looking forward to the essays. We're gonna have some good ones, aren't we? Now everybody's like, uh-oh. Okay, the other thing that is coming up due is the topic and project format. Those are due Sunday, March 6th. So we've got a couple of weeks, but I want you guys to start thinking about these. There's information on Blackboard under project information. And you can choose one of the topics there. You can choose a different topic. All I ask is that it's an epidemic. And this is the big assignment for the whole course, the biggest assignment. So you are going to need to do research on, library research or internet research. And the format, I'm very flexible about formats. You can write a paper, you can do a presentation. What I'm looking for is for you guys to demonstrate that you are picking good sources. And so I've got those crap worksheets that'll help you figure out if your sources are good. And I want you to demonstrate that you can take this information that you learn about and communicate it in some way. So presentations and papers are the most common things done, but I've had students do graphic novels. I've had students write original songs and perform them for the class. That's always good. So, you know, let those creative juices flow. Okay. All right. So last time we met, one of the things we talked about was the French researcher who originally discovered the virus and how the American researcher tried to steal credit for it. The French researcher, Luc, last name I can't pronounce, passed away this past weekend. So I saw him in the news and I thought it was worth mentioning. Okay. One of the things that happened during the AIDS pandemic that is not typical of a pandemic, that makes one of the things that makes the AIDS pandemic unique is that there was a huge grassroots movement pushing for understanding and funding and support for people with HIV. One of the early groups was ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which formed in 1987. And the goal was to improve the lives of people with HIV. They used civil disobedience. They used radical actions. One of the things they did was they broke into the CBS studio during the evening news and, you know, tried to get on the evening news. And this was back when, if you wanted to know the news, you watched the evening news and you watched it on ABC, CBS, or NBC, because those were your choices. They were protesting against the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is, until recently, an outspoken opponent to the use of condoms. They seem to have this idea that sex should be within a marriage and it should be for producing children. I don't know what world they're living in, but I think most people like to have sex other than when they're just trying to have children. They shut down the FDA for a day. They managed to get into their building and they weren't able to work for a day. This is the group that put up the inflatable condom on Jesse Helm's front lawn. So lots of things to get attention, right? Lots of really controversial things. But they also created what's called the AIDS quilt. And so the photo here is the National Mall in Washington. And each one of these sections here is an individual quilt. And the individual quilts are made up of small sections of fabric. Each one of those small sections is dedicated to somebody who died of AIDS. So many people who died of AIDS didn't get proper funerals. The family wouldn't pay for a funeral because it was scandalous. So people began making these quilt squares with people's names. And you can see there's one here, the date, the 18th of August, 93 was the death date for Hans Odenhoven. And the quilt was first demonstrated, and this black and white picture is the first time the quilt was laid out. And that was in 1987. So try and imagine that each one of these white squares has 40 or 50 individual people that it's representing who have died of AIDS. That was also the last time the entire AIDS quilt was on display. It's too big now, and you might see parts of it on display periodically, but the whole thing, it's just, there's no space big enough to display it. Remember, worldwide, we're talking about 36 million deaths from AIDS.
Is that the year to date, or was that like in the 80s alone?
That is to date this year, or honestly, probably last year or the year before. But 1987 also saw some good news. There was a company called Burroughs Wellcome. And yes, it was spelled that way. And in 1987, they were awarded their drug, the first drug to teach AIDS, was approved. That was AZT. Now, before it was officially approved, word got out that they had a drug that they were testing. And this was the Burroughs Wellcome building. Really bizarre building. Bizarre inside and outside too. All of these weird angles. It was a mess. It was a mess trying to work in that building. So they were getting lots and lots of calls. People saying, we want the drug. We want this drug now. Please, can we get our child or our friend or our lover into the trials so we can get this drug? AIDS is a death sentence. We need something. And they even got death threats. People calling in and saying, I'm going to blow up your building if you don't get my son in your clinical trial. Now, at that time, Burroughs Wellcome didn't have the facility needed to test the drug in-house. So they sent it to the National Cancer Institute, the federal government, for testing, and they sent it to Duke University for testing. Well, you know what happens. You got this researcher at Duke, I'm sorry, at the National Cancer Institute, who tried to claim that he should get credit for AZT, Sam Broder. What is it with these older guys all trying to claim credit for stuff that they didn't do because they knew that their name would end up in the history books if they could get their name associated with something? Well, you know, Sam Broder's name is in the history book, but for being an asshole. He sued Burroughs Wellcome in court. The case was dismissed because his lab tech was questioned on the stand and said, well, Broder doesn't even come in the lab. So yeah, he still claims credit for the discovery of AZT, but that wasn't it. That wasn't the person who did it. During this time period, my mother worked for Burroughs Wellcome in the virology department. Now, she wasn't a virologist, but she knew the people there. She knew the people who discovered AZT. I knew a lot of the people. When she first got the job, she was told that they were working on HIV, and she was like, okay. And then she got there and she found out her desk was in the lab. She thought she would be in an office somewhere. So she was a little concerned, but they didn't work with the virus on site because the virus requires something called a BSL-3, also called P3. All right. So what is a BSL? BSL stands for biosafety level. And a BSL-1 is stuff like a cold virus, not very dangerous. And you work on it at a lab bench, you wear gloves, that's about it. BSL-2 is a little dangerous, not likely to kill you, but it might make you sick. BSL-3, potentially disabling or lethal. So HIV is considered a BSL-3 level virus because it has the potential to disable or kill you. And a BSL-3 is an interesting place to work. So I worked in one when I worked on HIV. So I worked in one for about 5 years. It's a locked area. There is what's called negative pressure. So air flows into the BSL-3. So when you open the door, the air comes in from behind you, so it doesn't wash back into the more public areas. The air then has to go through very strong filtration before being released, so that anything that's potentially in there will get filtered out. Even inside the BSL-3, is it similar to a vacuum environment? Yes, yes, you can think of it as similar to a vacuum type environment. Yeah. Even inside the facility, you work in a device called a hood or a biosafety cabinet. Nobody calls it a biosafety cabinet. We all call them hoods, where you literally have a glass or plexiglass screen. There's a space about this high for your arms to reach in. Again, there's negative pressure, so the air from the room flows into the hood. And you turn on ultraviolet light when you're not working on it to completely sterilize the interior of it. Yes, there is a BSL-4. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Due to these negative pressures, it can be really hard to maintain an appropriate temperature. So the BSLs can be really, really hot or really, really cold, depending on the outside weather, because you're getting lots of fresh air moving through there. And anything that goes into a BSL-3 does not come out without being sterilized. People are the exception there. So when I worked in a BSL-3, we had a scanner in the back. So anything we wrote down, we would have to scan it and send the digital copy to our computers outside. Trash went through what's called an autoclave. Ours was a pass-through autoclave, literally this huge device. I would put the trash into the autoclave. The autoclave has very high pressure, very high temperatures, and it destroys everything. I mean, it just destroys everything. And then to take the trash out, I would go to the other side of the autoclave. I would leave the BSL-3 to get the trash out the other side. Anything that can't fit through an autoclave, and our autoclave was big, it had to be bleached before it was brought out of the P3. Bleach is very destructive. It's destructive to a lot of things. If you worked in the P3, you would wear what we called a bunny suit, those little white Tyvek suits, booties over your feet, gloves, 2 pairs of gloves, not just one. And there was a distinct procedure for leaving the BSL-3. You take off this part and then you take off that thing to try and minimize the risk of exposing yourself to anything that might have gotten on your gown or your gloves. And then you go out and you wash your hands. When Burroughs Wellcome built their first P3, the safety officer looked at the plan and told the woman in charge, the door is not American with Disabilities compliant. It's not big enough for a wheelchair. Marty had to point out that if a wheelchair goes into a BSL-3, it doesn't come back out. There's no way that you can sterilize a wheelchair. So they were able to get past that one. All right. Jerry asked, is there a BSL-4? Yes, there is. BSL-4 is for potentially disabled or lethal diseases that are transmitted through, my typing is horrible right now, through the air.
Like an outbreak. That movie. I wish we
Yes.
could watch. It's a great movie.
That movie's so good.
None of you guys were even born when it came out, though.
I've still seen it. The one with Cuba Gooding Jr. and Dustin Hoffman.
Yeah, it was a great R.I.P. Dustin Hoffman. No, is he alive still?
He's
Yeah.
alive. He's just really
Yeah.
old.
Yeah, he is. Great movie.
Is that the one where they saved the world with blood from a monkey?
Patient Zero. They were trying to,
Yeah.
they were trying to find Patient Zero. Yeah, it was Ebola, I think, and it went airborne, and
Yeah.
they had like
And then they
space
tried to
suits.
bomb that whole city in California to get rid of it.
Oh yeah, great movie.
I saw that movie. I saw it in the theater. I think I ruined everybody else's experience because I was laughing so hard at how bad the science was.
But my question is, was that outfit BSL-4? Because they had their own oxygen, kind of like a astronaut suit. So that's what I was wondering.
Yes, that's a BSL-4 outfit. It's much bigger. It's not the little white Tyvek bunny suit. And yeah, you have your own air supply.
And then they still had the decontamination area when it sprayed whatever those gases were.
Yes.
That's expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive and it's pretty serious. There are not a lot of BSL-4 labs out there. I haven't heard the latest news, but it used to be the only places that had them were the CDC and the military,
Right.
the US.
And that's who they were in that movie. It was the CDC and the military only. So what would qualify for that? Like what disease or virus we know of that will qualify for that type of protocol?
Smallpox.
Oh, wow.
Not COVID-19 because it's widespread, but the other 2 coronaviruses that have come out in the past few years, MERS and SARS, both of which have mortality rates like 30% mortality. Fortunately, we eliminated those before they got widespread. That would have been nasty. Tuberculosis, especially drug-resistant tuberculosis. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about here. If we got plague that was antibiotic resistant, we would that would be the kind of thing we're talking about. The really big nasties. And they generally do, I know if they don't know how a disease spreads and it's very deadly, like Ebola in the early days, they would use a BSL-4. We know a little more about Ebola. We know it's not respiratory. So it's probably a P3, a BSL-3 level at this point. I can't swear to that though. All right, so AZT was a very expensive drug at the beginning, but it was it. That was all that there was. And it had really nasty side effects. It caused heart damage, liver damage. We still use AZT today, but we use it in lower doses, so it doesn't have the same heart and lung damage problems. And we use it in a combination with other treatments. ACT UP, love my group of antiviral warriors, decided to protest the high cost of AZT. And a group of them came into the main entrance at Burroughs Wellcome, dressed up in suits, told the person at the front desk, we have a meeting. They looked like they might have a meeting, so okay. And they said, could we use the bathroom to freshen up before our meeting? And the guy's like, yeah, sure, the bathroom's over there. They crossed the lobby, and instead of going into the bathrooms, they got into the elevator. And they went upstairs. They found their way into an office, shut the door, used steel plates to rivet the door closed. Now, the idea was that they were going to open one of these windows and hang this big banner on the outside of the building. None of these windows open. So that didn't work. So they called the news instead and told the news what was going on. Security, the building security and the county sheriff finally had to cut through the drywall into the office to get them out. I have a lot of respect for them for doing this, but man, that was a day.
Was your mother there?
I think she was. She was certainly working for Burroughs Wellcome at the time, but she wasn't in the upper levels. They hid the virologist down in the basement. It would be 1995, 7 years later before a second drug was approved. So it was a long time before a second treatment was made. All right, this is a screenshot moment. When we look at HIV, and this is some relatively modern data, right? 2014, 2018. And we look at who has the highest per capita, or sorry, this is total number of people who are infected. What do we see? White heterosexual women, Latino heterosexual women, African-American heterosexual men, those have the lowest rates. People who inject drugs, now they have a higher percentage of people who inject drugs are HIV positive, but there aren't as many people who are drug users or injectable drug users. Then we see African-American heterosexual women, white gay and bisexual men, Latino gay and bisexual men, and African-American gay and bisexual men. Now, African-Americans are not the majority of the population in the US, but there are a lot more individuals who are infected in that community when compared to the white or the Latino groups. And Latinos, also a lot higher percent infected than white. So this has been a problem since the 90s, the early 2000s. Even though drugs were available during these time periods, AIDS continued to ravage these communities. The rate of infection among African American women in the 90s was 15 times higher than for white women. Among men, it was 5 times higher. In 2002, half of all new HIV diagnoses were in African Americans. Why? Why is this group disproportionately affected? There are a couple of reasons for this. I mean, the underlying thing is long-term systemic racism in this country. But we'll start with poverty. African Americans have a higher poverty rate than white Americans, even today. Julia, go ahead.
I thought you were asking for the reason, so I was just going to say what you were about to say. That unfortunately, like, for some reason in this country, most of the impoverished areas and citizens are people of color.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but that's just how it is, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's probably a good history class you can take that talks about that, but it's a long-term problem. So poverty, what does poverty get you? Less access to healthcare. Less access to quality education. Malnourishment. Lack of organization. So when we talk about the poverty part, people who are, there is a direct relationship between the level of poverty and the HIV rate. The poorest communities have the highest rates of HIV. Even my cat's unhappy about this one. So you can't get health care. You've got crappy schools. You can't afford HIV medication. But you also don't learn about the problem the same way that communities that have better access to health care might learn about the problem. There's a lack of organization. So the white gay community is dominated by highly educated, wealthier, well, okay, white men who are comfortable and secure in their position in life so that they can say, I'm gay. And they've been able to say this for a lot longer than the more impoverished people. And so they organized and educated each other. So that's a big part of the problem. We can also look at family disintegration, which is a legacy of slavery.
That's what I was going to say first over anything. We just don't have the culture of communicating well with each other about these things, or the structure, because, you know, in this era, the 80s, there were no dads really, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. During slavery, of course, families were broken apart, members were sold, and so the culture lost a lot of those community ties. And with unemployment and the insanely high incarceration, that also contributes to breaking down families. A lot of this was the war on drugs, which hit African Americans much, much harder than it hit white Americans. We also know that African Americans have longer prison sentences. Right now, we have the highest percentage of our population in jail of any country in the world. Incarceration also leads to unsafe sex. You know, people are going to have sex. It's not like the prisons are giving out condoms. And sharing of needles. People smuggle needles in, and they're highly valuable in prison. And having a family structure that doesn't have long-term male-female partnerships means that everybody has more partners. The more sexual partners you have, the higher your risk of STDs, including HIV. And single family households or single parent households have lower incomes, more likely to have the poverty. Oh, and here we go again. So these two things intertwined really, really contributed to the high rate of HIV. We can also add distrust of authorities. So these communities are less likely to believe the CDC. Of course, nowadays, now that we're all experiencing a lot of problems with misinformation about the current pandemic, I think they just were ahead of their time there. Less likely to trust the news. These days, I don't trust the news. Can't blame them for that. And then there's the fact that medical care for African Americans is often inferior to what you see for white Americans. Doctors are less likely to believe African Americans' symptoms than they are white Americans, especially women. All doctors are less likely to believe women than men. So white men, you get believed by your doctors. Women, African Americans, not as much. And then, of course, there's the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is not the only study that used African Americans, but it's syphilis. Let me spell syphilis correctly. But it's probably the best known one, or at least the one that I hear about the most. This was supposed to be a research program that studied the progression of untreated syphilis. And they recruited impoverished African American men. Now, if it was a real research study, they would have found men who were infected, right? Well, they didn't find enough infected men, so they infected them. Deliberately infected these people with syphilis. And why did they do this? Well, that's an incredibly good question, because there was already a treatment for syphilis at the time. They didn't give the people in this study the treatment. So a lot of African American males were deliberately infected with this disease that can be fatal. It can cause neurological damage. It can cause a lot of other health problems, and they weren't given the available treatment. Why do you think African Americans don't trust doctors?
Because we haven't been given a reason to, I feel like.
Yeah.
That's with everything this country's put them through.
Yep. Can I please write that? You want me to write all the stuff about the syphilis experiment?
If it's gonna be on a test or something, if not, then it's fine.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ask a question on the details of that. It's one of those things that I think we should be aware of, but it's one of those things that just pisses me off.
Yeah.
There's a lot that pisses me off these days. I'm a very angry woman. There's one other thing that contributed, and that was that the information on AIDS showed white middle-class Americans or white gay men or even white IV drug users. All the early information showed white people. And a lot of this educational material was presented in schools, like high schools, to try and teach people about this potential problem before they had the chance to get infected. Well, thanks to systemic racism, poverty, African Americans are more likely to have high rates of absenteeism and drop out of school compared to white Americans. All right, so take a screenshot because I want to type a couple of more things here. Oops. So we're seeing lack of access to good healthcare. We're seeing discrimination. We're seeing the movement of people in the African American AIDS experience that's largely due to unemployment and incarceration and failures of the government to educate and fund research. These 4 points we're going to see over and over and over again. They contribute to epidemics and pandemics throughout history. And in fact, you can say we're seeing a lot of this right now, right? In America, good quality healthcare is expensive. The people who are being discriminated against are largely the frontline workers, the poorer people. Although we also early on, well, I guess we're still seeing some of this. We would see a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans because it came from China. We're not seeing movement of people in the US for this pandemic, but certainly traveling caused the disease to spread around the world quickly. We are definitely seeing a failure of the government to educate people and to fund research. All right. So to wrap up the state of HIV today, over 1.2 million Americans are HIV positive. Over 700,000 Americans have died of AIDS. Globally, we're talking 76 million infected and 36 million dead. But we now have over a dozen different medications and treatments AIDS-related deaths have declined by 60%. Over half of that decline in the past decade. We've worked out better treatment strategy, which drugs can be combined with which drugs. Many HIV positive people are living decades with the disease. I will post this on YouTube. Usually it'll be later in the day. Depends on how busy YouTube is. All right, sorry, answering the question in the chat. The thought is these people, HIV positive, might be considered chronic, and those people will have a near normal life expectancy. What I think is fabulous is the educational messages. Even the drug commercials are starting to show a diversity of people. It's not just white men anymore. It's trans people, it's African American people, it's women. Lots more diversity in these commercials. Unfortunately, the rate of new infections is pretty steady. Part of that reason is that 1 out of every 7 people who are HIV positive don't know it. And those people are much more likely to progress to AIDS and eventually die. African Americans are disproportionately infected, especially in the American South and the Bible Belt. There's still a lot of discrimination against gay men. And if we talk about not the US, but worldwide, there are still countries where this pandemic is not, it's still raging at huge, huge levels. There are 9 countries where the rate of adults infected, the percentage of adults infected is over 10%. So there are 9 countries where more than 10% of all adults are infected with HIV. In the US, the rate is 0.3%. All right. That wraps up the conversation on HIV. Anything else you want to know? Anything you want to comment on?
Could we use like a deadly virus to kill another deadly virus?
No.
Okay.
I'm putting a big asterisk there because biology always does things that you don't expect, but based on what we know about viruses nowadays, the answer would be no. Viruses have to infect. They can infect bacteria. You can go after bacteria with a virus, but they have to go after something with a cell. Okay. Smallpox. This is our next disease. Both of these boys are infected with smallpox. You can see the one on the left had not received the vaccine. The one on the right, you can see a couple of pustules on his face, but he was vaccinated. So that's what the vaccine did for smallpox.
I feel like I've seen this picture before.
You probably have.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of pictures out there of people who have smallpox, because smallpox has been eliminated. It doesn't exist in the wild anywhere. Why? One of the reasons we're talking about it is because this, and there's a cow disease, a disease that infects cattle. Those are the only two things we've ever successfully eliminated disease-wise. And we're going to talk about how that happened and why we were able to eliminate smallpox. But I want to read you from a book called The Demon in the Freezer by Richard Preston, a little introduction to smallpox. The red areas spread into blotches across the face and arms, and within hours, the blotches broke out into seas of tiny pimples. They were sharp feeling, not itchy, and by nightfall, they covered the face, arms, hands, and feet. Pimples were rising out of the soles of the feet and on the palms of the hands. During the night, the pimples developed tiny blistered heads, and the heads continued to grow larger, rising all over the body at the same speed, like a field of barley sprouting after the rain. They hurt dreadfully and were enlarging into boils. They had a waxy, hard look, and they seemed unripe. Fever soared abruptly and began to rage. The rubbing of pajamas on the skin felt like a roasting fire. By dawn, the body had become a mass of knob-like blisters. They were everywhere, all over, clustered most thickly on the face and extremities. The inside of the mouth and ear canals and sinuses had pustulated. It felt as if the skin was pulling off of the body, that it would split and rupture. The blisters were hard and dry, and they didn't leak. They were like ball bearings, embedded in the skin with a soft, velvety feel on the surface. Each pustule had a dimple in the center. They were pressurized with an opalescent pus. The pustules began to touch one another, and finally they emerged into confluent shapes that covered the body like a cobblestone street. The skin was torn away across the body, and the pustules on the face combined into a bubbled mass filled with fluid until the skin of the face essentially detached from its underlayers and became a bag surrounding the tissues of the head. Tongue, gums, and hard palate were studded with pustules, the mouth dry. The virus had stripped the skin off the body, both inside and out, and the pain seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature to endure. Nate, go ahead.
Was that Richard Preston? Because I think I've read an excerpt from that book before. The name just sounds familiar. Thanks.
Yep. He's written several books about viruses and diseases. Okay. Putting things into perspective. As of this week, worldwide, COVID has killed 24 million people. AIDS has killed 36 million. Smallpox killed probably over 500 million. we don't have a great number for smallpox deaths because it's something that's ravaged humanity for centuries, probably millennia. So we don't have an accurate count, but I want you to realize that smallpox was eliminated in the mid 1900s, and we had our first smallpox vaccine in the 1700s. So it killed an incredibly high percentage of the people who were alive during the time when smallpox was still around. Nate, go ahead.
So was this actually like the very first vaccine ever created?
Yes, it was.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, it was. And Nate, you might be the only person, well, Jerry has said things that make me think he might be a little older than everybody else. You got a scar, a little circular scar on the back of your arm. That's a smallpox vaccine scar.
I see that with a lot of my like Asian friends. They would come of a certain age, they would have that on the shoulder.
Yeah.
That circular scar thing. Yeah.
Yeah. They often give it to people in the military still, which is why I mentioned you, Nate. I've got one. My husband, who is 2 years older than me, does not. So I was one of the last Americans to get the vaccine. Yeah,
Yep,
that makes
got
sense.
it.
Huh?
I said that and a ton of other shots I got when I
Yes.
was at basic training. You get like, I think it's like 10 within like a span of 5 weeks or something like that. So there was definitely a few of them.
Yeah, I've heard that that's pretty miserable.
There's one shot. It's called the peanut butter shot. I think it's just a penicillin shot. It goes on the derriere. And actually remember, I was one of the I think I had an appointment or something and I lucked out and I didn't get it. But I remember a bunch of my people that were in my flight, like I was in the Air Force, that's what they call like the group of people you go to basic with. They were like having trouble sitting down for like 3 days just because of how uncomfortable it was. But yeah, I mean, you got to get them. So
yeah, that one is to treat any STDs that you might be coming in with. Yeah, my dad described when he went in the Air Force, he said that he kind of walked down a line and there were people standing there injecting in both shoulders. And
yeah,
so,
actually, it's kind of similar to that. They had like I don't know if it's literally simultaneously, but you go to one person, like, okay, they highlight your name, and then you go to another person. Like, I had to get I was going to Japan, so I had to go to get a Japanese encephalitis, and there was just a lot of them. So yeah, it is kind of like that now that you mention it. Not to that extent, but quite literally similar.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, smallpox caused by a virus, just like HIV. And I want to make sure that we're remembering what a virus is. So first off, antibiotics do not work against viruses. Every living thing has viruses that can infect it. So even bacteria get infected by viruses. They're just universal. There are millions of types of viruses. There are no general antiviral drugs. Antiviral drugs tend to target a specific virus. We're getting better. We've got some things that will work against several different viruses these days, but it's not like an antibiotic. You know, an antibiotic, you have a bacterial infection, they can, unless you're allergic, they can give you penicillin. It works against a huge range of bacteria. We don't have that for viruses. Nate, go ahead.
Just a little thing about penicillin, that they actually derived that from the mold, right? Penicillin. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So we think about diseases, we think primarily about bacteria, which are living organisms. The origin of the word virus is just something that causes disease. And it originally was not clearly identified what they were. We discovered bacteria much earlier than we discovered viruses. Okay, screenshot time.
Is it because you know, bacteria are bigger? to
Oh,
see?
yes. Absolutely.
I know, because what the first, you know, what electron telescope was like in the 50s or something like that. And some guys, like you said, some white guys took the credit, and the woman was the first one to view it, I think.
There's a long history of that.
Right.
Okay, so when we talk about a virus, viruses are not considered living organisms. Basically, they are considered parasitic particles. Unless they are infecting a host, they are basically inert. They're not doing anything. They're just kind of sitting there. They can't.
Would dormant be like a good word for that?
Yeah, dormant would be a good word for that as well. Yeah. They can't reproduce without infecting a cell. They don't do any metabolism without infecting a cell. So let's compare them to bacteria, because bacteria are living organisms. When bacteria were first discovered, we didn't know that there were viruses separately. So some of the early research called bacteria viruses. We've only changed that relatively recently. Viruses are around 500 times smaller than bacteria. A virus consists of genetic material either DNA or RNA wrapped in a protein coat. They insert their genetic material into a host cell. The host cell then makes new virus particles or virions. We say that viruses are obligate intracellular parasites. Obligate means they have to be, intra inside cell, and parasites because they use the host cell to replicate, to grow, to do all of the things we think of as living. And when we say something is living, the official definition includes metabolism, homeostasis, oh, there's a big word for us, reproduction, evolution, and response to the environment. Everybody has slightly different lists, but this is kind of your basic list of what it means to be living. So metabolism, taking in energy and nutrients and using them for functions inside. Homeostasis. Has anybody heard this one before? Does anybody remember what it is?
Something, does it have anything to do with the condition that they live in, or? Nah, I think I've heard the term. I can't
It's
recall.
like-
maintaining internal balance, isn't that it?
Yeah. Maintaining relatively stable internal conditions. So in our bodies, it's body temperature, blood pH, that kind of stuff. Reproduction, evolution, responding to changes in the environment. So obviously we can respond to changes in the environment. It's cold, we put on a coat. Nate, go ahead.
So even though that these viruses may have some of these properties, they have to meet all criterion in order to be considered. So they're kind of like pseudo living when the conditions are right. Would you say that's accurate?
I like to say that they are right on the line between chemical reactions and living organisms. So they're right there on that line. Most people don't consider them living, but we also use a lot of terminology related to living things, because when they infect a host cell, they do act like a living organism. So viruses do evolve. When they're infecting a host cell, they do reproduce. Do they respond to the environment? Only in terms of if the environment includes a cell that they can infect, they'll infect it. That's about all. It's not going to respond to heat or dryness or anything like that. Does it have a metabolism? Not really, because it uses the metabolism of the cell it infects. Does it maintain homeostasis? No, it doesn't do that. So it's got some of these characteristics of living things, but not all. And of course, they don't move on their own. There's no flagella or cilia or anything that allows a virus to move around on its own. It moves through the air by breezes. It moves through the water when the water moves. It moves through your bloodstream once it's in your blood because your blood is moving. When they do infect a cell, they use the cell to create really, really large numbers of viruses. So lots and lots of offspring. It can be up in the millions. And each one of those virions is capable of infecting a new cell or a new host. So if you're producing 1 million virus particles from one cell, yeah, that has the potential to infect 1 million more cells. Now, some types of viruses are generalist. Generalist means they can infect lots of cell types and lots of species. So a lot of these are what we call zoonotic. Zoonotic just means it can infect animals and people. So flu can infect some animals and people. It's a pretty generalist virus. Others are going to be species specific. Or even cell type specific. We saw that with HIV, which can only infect CD4 positive white blood cells. All right. This is a picture, a drawing of a smallpox virus. It has DNA for its genetic material. It's got enzymes in here. It's got a couple of membranes and some proteins sticking out of the membrane. Everybody get a screenshot of this one? So you can see that kind of hourglass shape. That is pretty characteristic of smallpox. The virus, there are actually two viruses that cause smallpox: variola major and variola minor. These are not related to chickenpox. Chickenpox is a herpes virus. So chickenpox is related to herpes. Smallpox is not. Now, there are lots of pox viruses. They're common in all vertebrates. So there are lizard poxes and bird poxes and crocodile poxes and dolphins, even some invertebrate animals can get pox virus infections. So I think there's a grasshopper pox, for example. Okay. Are the enzymes used to help enter the host cell? Yes. Yes, they are to help enter the host cell and to hijack the host cell protein manufacturing equipment. It's exactly what those enzymes do. And we are out of time. Okay, any questions?
Due date for the essay, it's just a like end of week period, like standard deadline. Okay.
Sunday before midnight.
Now, I think you've mentioned it a couple times. I'm not going to use it as a primary source, but is Wikipedia okay? Like as like a secondary source?
Yeah, I don't want you to use Wikipedia as your only source, but I will tell you that as a general rule, when we're talking about most diseases, it's pretty damn reliable.
Okay, because I do plan on, not like I said as a major part, but like I'm doing the prompt for like celebrities, and I found like the wiki page on Freddie Mercury, like it has a good job of summarizing like, because it talks about like how he thought he had the virus in 1982. He had like white lesions on his tongue, and then it explained chronologically. It's like a good summary, and that's why I wanted to use it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thanks, and have a great day.
You're
To
welcome.
every one of my classmates. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.